Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Christine Reyna, and we're going to talk about the psychology of prejudice. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to our conversation. And I want to begin by saying happy Juneteenth, which is America's Emancipation Day, and I think very relevant to the topic for today.
Thank you for mentioning that. First question, how do you define prejudice?
Yeah, so prejudice, I'm in my field, which is social psychology. Prejudice is defined as an emotional reaction to a person or a group or any type of target that is not necessarily based on any type of fact or knowledge or prior experience. So the word literally is prejudging, right? So we meet somebody or we encounter somebody and we have sort of this preemptive emotional or psychological reaction that is often negative. So we have a negative reaction towards somebody based solely on their group membership or some aspect of them or the environment.
Okay. I think that's important to kind of point out. It literally means prejudging, right? To prejudge somebody. So, without having information about this person, you have an automatic or knee-jerk negative emotional response to them. So, that seems pretty broad, right? Like it could be really anything. It could be based on group membership, it could be based on just how they look, right?
Yeah.
I guess like a more general question about prejudice is one, like, do you think that it comes from some like evolutionary instinct to kind of be wary of the other?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think prejudices in general come from probably from something that was once adaptive, but also can be adaptive in certain circumstances. So for example, I mean, just to kind of give some context, we have prejudices towards all kinds of things. We have prejudices towards foods, for example, or towards certain animals or certain environments. So this idea that we have that our tendency is to first be cautious or protective of ourselves definitely comes from definitely has its evolutionary advantages, right? So we have these sort of evolved detection systems that warn us about threats. So we know, for example, from cognitive and even perceptual and brain research that people are much more like perceptually, we are much more sensitive to threatening stimuli than we are to unthreatening stimuli. So we tend to perceive it faster. We tend to have quicker reactions to things that are negative or potentially threatening. Um, and so that system actually is quite adaptive, right? So our capacity to anticipate a threat or to be vigilant in novel environments where we might not know whether we are safe or not is actually like there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's perfectly adaptive. Where prejudices, especially social prejudices, become maladaptive is when that sense of threat is rooted in things like stereotypes or negative narratives about groups that really aren't found that really aren't rooted in reality.
Okay, it's interesting that you pointed that out. I never thought of the idea of being prejudiced against food. But that makes sense, right? Like, you can be prejudiced against anything. You can just you look at a dish and just think like, "Oh, that just doesn't look good, so I don't wanna try it. It looks gross," or something
Yeah.
like that. And that would fall under the definition of prejudice, right?
Right. Right.
Okay. So that would be okay, yeah, yeah. Alright, so if it's the case that, it could have been adaptive, right? And it was evolutionarily advantageous, then being prejudiced in and of itself isn't a bad thing, right? Like, we need more context. Right? So you're saying that when
Yeah.
it becomes problematic is really when we're prejudiced against other people based on maybe false narratives and like stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
And then so we treat them worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to just continue on with the evolutionary thread, I think another thing to remember is that when it comes to threat, especially things like threats to safety, right? Assuming that, like there's a little bit of an asymmetry of cost, right? So a false negative, meaning like you don't assume the person's threatening, but in fact they are, that could cause, harm or potentially death, right? A false positive, assuming that a person is threatening when they are not, means you avoid them. Sometimes it can mean you attack them, though. And so what ends up happening is that when it comes to things that are novel or uncertain, a lot of people, not everyone's, but a lot of people's initial reaction is to keep their distance, to avoid things like that. So a lot of like everyday prejudices really are about avoiding people and avoiding situations. Now, of course, we know on the opposite end of that, that it could become quite destructive and quite violent, as in the case of genocides and things like that. So, this idea that we might be initially reticent around novelty, you know, another wonderful hallmark of the human species is that despite the fact that we have um, these systems that enable us to protect ourselves, we are also an incredibly cooperative species. Like we are fundamentally a group oriented species, which will be relevant in this conversation. We form groups, we survive within groups, but we also are really good at cooperating with people. I mean, you just go about your day at any city and you pass thousands of total strangers every day from all walks of life, different religions, different background cultures, and it happens without incident, right? I mean, how do we build incredible metropolises, you get thousands and thousands of people who don't know each other and they cooperate. They coordinate their behaviors towards a common goal in order to build a skyrise or high speed internet or whatever. And so we have the capacity to cooperate because we're very good at being in groups. And so what ends up happening is oftentimes the things that make us really good at forming groups with the people we identify with, which we call in groups, those same motives can actually become very dangerous with groups that we don't identify with, which we call out groups.
Mm, okay. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So, given that we have almost like competing instinctual reactions to things, right? Like there's this, we are by nature social creatures, right? So I think just innately we cooperate with others. We're dependent on other people. So we have that part of ourselves. But then there's this other, like being fearful of the stranger part of ourselves that can sometimes conflict with the cooperation side of ourselves, right? So then the question is, how do we figure out a way to address the problematic prejudices that seem to be quite instinctual, right? By appealing to perhaps the other part of our nature.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And that's what typically happens when we look at groups that do merge either for instrumental reasons like trade or things like that, or even emotionally, like interracial marriages or things like that. What we end up seeing is that when people have an opportunity to interact in really meaningful ways and to really get to know each other and to share common goals in environments that are not oppressive towards one of the groups, that people do find a lot of common ground, right? It's just getting to that point where people are willing to take that risk. And the whole story of human history is the story of people largely willing to take that risk. I mean, we're the only species that has populated every single continent on Earth because we're nomadic and we travel around and we meet other people and we share culture and technology and food and things like that, but we also engage in warfare. And so what really is the challenge is, what are the things that trigger that sense of threat or that trigger that sense of zero sum competition that makes people want um, to oppress or exploit other groups?
Yeah. I've always thought that the way to combat prejudice is through exposure, which is kind of makes me think of what you just said, right? Like if people just have a chance to get to know one another, like we would realize that we have much more in common than we do, different, right? Like, and I feel like once you figure that out, it's much easier to connect with other people. Have you ever heard of Oh my goodness, I'm totally blanking on his name. He's that black jazz musician who befriended KKK members.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
Daryl
definitely.
Davis. Daryl Davis.
Yes,
So
yes.
it was really sad. I actually interviewed him, but his name just blanked on me. Daryl Davis, right? That's one of the things that he says. Like if you spend 10 minutes with somebody, you realize that you'll have something in common, right? And if you spend 10 more minutes, you'll find something else in common,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
do you think that that is okay? So that makes sense in terms of like a one-on-one encounter. Like me as an individual citizen, I could take that extra step to, befriend somebody else from a different group, right? I can put myself in that environment.
Yeah.
But the another question is how we design social institutions, or how do we affect social institutions such that these personal efforts wouldn't be as necessary.
So I'm going to take a step back and start with those dyadic exchanges. So there's a couple of things. So yes, by and large, when we have an opportunity to get to know a person as a human being, we're going to find all sorts of commonalities, right? Um, but how the context in which those exchanges happen is really, really relevant, right? Mr. Davis, oftentimes met up with people at a bar, right? Equal, just two guys sitting at a bar or whatever, and then they would meet up at each other's houses or whatever. And in those cases, there's not an embedded status relationship. But unfortunately, especially in an American society, but anywhere on earth, it's going to be the same thing where different groups occupy different status positions. And that can make one, not only having meaningful interactions very challenging when you have a high status person interacting with a low status person, especially in a status oriented context. So, for example, a customer interacting with a busser at a restaurant is not going to be very meaningful because the customer is always going to have like more power, or a boss and a subordinate, right? That is not going to be that interaction is going to be heavily shaped by the confines of that power dynamic. So the subordinate will be operating and behaving in subordinate roles, and that those types of interactions that reinforce that hierarchy could actually have the ironic effect of reinforcing stereotypes, right? So if the only people who are different from us that we interact with are people who are lower status, we're always going to see them in a lower status context, and it's not going to deconstruct our stereotypes, it's going to reinforce them, right? So if we only see, people of color, especially, very marginalized people of color, like, in America, that would be, Black people and Hispanic people in labor types of jobs or low skilled types of jobs. We're going to get to know them within that context, and we're not going to necessarily see the potential of that individual as being, a philosopher or an intellectual or, somebody who is a community leader or things like that. So context really can shape how, what we learn in those types of interactions. And we have to always recognize that these types of context situations are really only effective or maximally effective in equal status types of situations and circumstances.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like in my mind, exposure means just like hanging out with people.
Yeah.
Like if you hang out with people and you just talk to them like a human being and not, as a server or a servant, then you'll realize that, like their kids don't listen to them either. You know?
Universal.
And it's like there are just certain things that are
Right.
universally true. Okay. And we can all bond over those things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Can,
okay.
can I say one other thing about that also, which, yes, I totally agree. In fact, a lot of times it's what's really kind of fun working at a college. I mean, there's lots of fun things working at a university, is that you meet a lot of people from really small towns coming to college for the first time. And like, I can't tell you how many times I've had students saying, like, I've never interacted with a Black person until I came to college. Like that's their reality, right? All they ever see is what the media says or what their families say. And then they come to college and they're interacting with people from different religions and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it's just like, it just opens their mind. And they're, a lot of times they're nervous, they don't know, they don't want to make mistakes, but it's important. It's important to have those experiences. It can have a downside in that, you have that some of my best friends are, right? So we want those interactions to be not only meaningful, but to generalize beyond just that individual relationship, because having meaningful interactions with somebody from an out group, from somebody who's from a different group, can make a person feel kind of licensed to do other prejudice things in other contexts, because they say, "Oh, well, I'm not prejudiced because I have this friend." And so generalizing beyond the dyad is really, really important as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up in a very diverse city and a diverse suburb within Los Angeles too.
Where? I'm from Los Angeles also.
Oh, really? I'm from Cerritos.
Oh, I'm from Pasadena.
My sister lives in Pasadena. Oh,
Great
wow.
town.
Well, so yeah, small world. Yeah, so, like, just having that background, I'm kind of not surprised, but I'm just a little disappointed when I meet people who, I guess, didn't grow up in such an environment, and because of that, I feel like they're much more wary of immigration.
Mhm.
You know, there's this fear that somehow, these immigrants are bad or they're gonna mess stuff up, you know? And I see this online often. So I was on Twitter and there was a far right British politician. I don't remember what his name was, but he posted something. It was a video of, I guess, an immigrant family or a community, and they were barbecuing something outside, like outside of their house. And it looked like it was like a makeshift barbecue, like they stacked some bricks or something like that. And he had a very negative reaction to that,
Hmm.
which found was very strange. Because like, my reaction is like, "Well, what are they cooking? Like, it's probably gonna be really
Yeah,
good," you
right.
know? But his reaction is like,
Excited?
maybe for him, it's just, these people are weird because they're not supposed to be barbecuing outside of their house with a makeshift barbecue or something like that. Maybe that's what the reaction was. And so I felt like it was grounded in some sort of, again, like, fear of the other. Like, I don't like change. I don't like these people are eating this way, and I want Britain to stay the same or something.
Well, one interesting thing to note in that situation is, had that the same exact behavior been performed by a native, white British person, it wouldn't even show up on their psychological radar. They would be like, "Oh, look at this great sweet scene of a family barbecuing." Right? And so the thing is that our stereotypes color how we interpret information as well. Like, some very innocuous behavior can suddenly seem very threatening when it is filtered through the lens of our negative stereotypes about groups. Even though the same exact behavior performed by somebody else is going to be, seen as if not, neutral or even positive. And it makes me think of a lot of the black laws after the Civil War, when slavery was ended. There were a lot of laws that were designed to criminalize Black people just going about their daily life, right? So, because of course, I don't know if everyone knows this, but the amendment that ended slavery had a really, really big loophole, and that was, the exception was in the case of incarceration. So you can enslave people who are incarcerated. And so there was this, throughout the country, all kinds of laws, like, if you had sundown laws where, if you were in a white town after sundown, you could be arrested. And or like vagrancy laws, like if you were hanging out on your front porch, like, you can be arrested for, like, if you weren't working at that moment, you can be arrested for vagrancy. And those same exact behaviors done by a non-Black person would not be seen as criminal at all. And so how we make attributions for behaviors and how we interpret behaviors through our stereotypes can really, really impact, the types of fears that we have in our minds when we interact with people that we don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you think is the most effective way to battle prejudice?
Um, wow. Well, first of all, I mean, prejudice is very overdetermined. Like, there's a lot of different factors that go into prejudice. And so I don't think there's like one single thing. But if you're talking about effectiveness, yes, you're right. As a person, as an individual, our individual prejudices we're going to the more we meet people, the more we're going to realize that our stereotypes are not very accurate and not very effective, right? So we individuate people and we realize, no, that stereotype doesn't really apply. And then we meet someone else and we're like, no, that stereotype doesn't apply. And then after a while, you're just like, this stereotype is not really helpful. It's not useful. Can we change the world one diet at a time? I mean, that would take a long time. So really, the answer is to start with systemic changes, right? When you think about every major leap forward in terms of civil rights have come from the courts and the legislature long before the populace was emotionally, long before we didn't have prejudice. We still don't. We as a population still have our prejudices, and yet groups have rights, right? Because if we wait for everyone to be not prejudiced, we would be waiting for a very, very long time. And so, the systemic changes that create those opportunities for equality creates those situations where people can have meaningful contact in on equal footing, and then we start to see prejudices decline. Like one example is gay marriage, for example, right? There was a lot of opposition to gay marriage for many, many generations, right? From the whole, the majority of the history of this country. And when the civil rights, when the Supreme Court finally ruled, first it started off with a handful of states, and then, the Supreme Court ruled. And now you look at, polling, and a lot of people, including a lot of conservative people, support gay marriage. Like when something becomes, normalized and supported, and you start to see it every day, and it's no longer criminalized or in whispered in the dark corners of society. People just start to realize, like, oh, it's no big deal. Oh no, my heterosexual marriage wasn't threatened by the some gay marriage, 5 cities away or something, And so I think that that really is the way to make wholesale change and to really create situations where people can start to confront those prejudices. But, obviously we're in a period of backsliding right now. So
Do you have any specific examples in mind, like a specific changes that you think that we should enact to battle prejudice, like systemic changes?
the things that are working are exactly the things that are under assault right now. So So one thing that is relevant, we I just finished doing a research study looking at book banning, right? So one of the things that's really important is for people in America to understand that being American is not just being white. Like there is actually an implicit assumption. There's been research done where when you survey a lot of white Americans, they associate American with whiteness, and and the truth is we've always been a very, very diverse country, and different groups have their own experiences in America, their own histories, their own timelines and trajectories and struggles and triumphs. And yet in our schools, we only tell one group's perspective, right? We only have American history from the white European perspective. We only have philosophy from a European perspective, art from a European perspective. And so so really that indoctrination happens at a very, very young age. From the time children enter school, they're being implicitly told that there is one group whose histories and whose accomplishments and whose, creations and inventions matter. And there are lots of other groups where their histories and their accomplishments don't matter. And so when you only have that one-sided perspective, you're sort of halfway there towards white supremacy and racism. You have the supremacy piece. You have this, like, there's this one group that did all these great things. And so it's really, really important that children from a very, very early age understand that no, America, there's a lot of different people in America, and they all have their own histories and contributions. And when kids can start learning that at a very young age, seeing other groups as being part of your identity, as sharing that American identity is really, really valuable. And so when I look at these executive orders that are saying that, schools can no longer teach any type of racial or gender history, anything that is divisive or makes a group feel bad about their racial history, which is, slavery, Jim Crow, Juneteenth, all of these things. Basically, what it's doing is it's really reinforcing this the only experience that matters, or the default American experience, is the white American experience.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I feel like there's this other maybe psychological phenomenon that is getting attached to this prejudice, or prejudice reaction to, to foreigners or things that are different, right? Because one thing is just to be wary and to be fearful and to be, feel threatened by a group of people. The other part, another part is feeling superior to this like other group of people. Like I feel like what undergirds these two psychological reactions or states seem to be a little different, right? One is almost like preservation, just recognizing threats because I need to survive. The
Mhm.
other is almost, I feel insufficient about myself. And so if I can somehow feel I belong to this group that's superior to this other group, I can feel better about myself.
Well, you just said the two things are the foundations of white nationalism. As you know, I do study the psychology of white nationalism as well. And those are actually two forces in prejudice and discrimination in general. So taking a step back, and then I'll get to white nationalism in particular, is, one thing that is very universal is that we all feel really good about our in groups, right? So in group favoritism is a human universal, right? We favor our in groups. We think they're great. We seek our in groups when it comes to security. We tend to prioritize our in groups when it comes to, who we share our resources with, et cetera. But also threats, right? So threats to our resources, right? Threats to, what we might, why are people so upset about immigration? When you dig deeply, it tends to be rooted in what we call realistic and symbolic threats. So realistic threats are like threats to jobs, threats to resources, threats to safety, even though a lot of those things are, rooted in, exaggerated narratives or stereotypes, but also symbolic threats like, is what it means to be American, will that change? Or what it means to be British or German or whatever, is that going to change? Are our values going to change? Right. And so this idea of threats have always been hugely predictive of prejudice and discrimination. Now, when it comes to white nationalism in particular, what's really interesting, and you said it perfectly, you said these are two different forces, and yet they are together. They intertwine really, really in really important ways. And that is that, white nationalism is kind of this ambivalent ideology. So, when we spend time on white nationalist spaces, and we do we do qualitative data as well as quantitative, where we really try to understand like what's going on. And you really see this ambivalence, this idea of like the white race and our history is filled with greatness. We've done all these great accomplishments, and yet we're vulnerable, we're victims, we're under assault. There's a lot of, in fact, I'm about to present some research in Prague, where we really do a deep dive in like a lot of the fearful themes, like the, white genocide, and white people being under assault, white people, the great replacement theory, all of these things. Like there's a lot of themes of fear and vulnerability and victimization being paired with these themes of greatness. And why that's relevant is when a group feels like they're entitled to status or privilege, but they feel like that entitled privilege is being unjustly taken away, that's when you get the most toxic form of outrage. And that aggrieved entitlement is at the heart of a lot of, mass shooters, for example, workplace shooters, incels, far right extremists, things like that. So pairing those two things together, this extreme love of your group with the sense of threat and the sense of vulnerability, especially when you think that you deserve things that you're not getting or things that you perceive other people are taking away, that is a very, very toxic brew.
I think it's interesting just how complicated our psychologies are because theoretically you could separate these different motivations, right? So for instance, you could hold the position that, this particular country should be of this racial group and not believe that other groups are inferior.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like that's completely consistent. You could just believe, this is our country, that's your country, you stay over there and we stay over here. That's totally consistent. But it just there's this other element to it, right? That makes it racist, and there's a superiority part in it, and that's why I feel like there's this element where they just want to feel good about themselves, but maybe these people, they don't really have personal achievements or accomplishments that
Yeah,
can take pride in, and so they take the pride in the accomplishments of other people who share their race.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we call that there's a phenomenon in social psychology called basking in reflected glory. And it's when you have like a threat to your self-esteem, you can bolster your self-esteem by affiliating with other people or groups that are very successful. And we do see a lot of what we call it's called berging for short, BIRG, basking in reflected glory. Where we see a lot of racial berging, where people who are members of high status groups, so white men, most in particular, although there is a whole women's branch of racial extremism, but white men in particular occupy these spaces. And so these are people who, you know, by all historical accounts, should be at the top of the hierarchy. And yet, for whatever reason, they might not be as personally successful. Like maybe they're unemployed or underemployed. Maybe they're unsuccessful in terms of relationships. Whatever it is, they're they're struggling. They're often on the margins of society. They often have had personal failures. They lean towards groups that provide a narrative that says, no, it's not you, it's not your fault. You're actually great. You're part of something great and noble. It's these, fill in the blank with the scapegoats, immigrants, Jewish people, whatever, Muslims, Black people who are taking this away unjustly. And if you join our cause, you will be a hero.
The great replacement theory I also find interesting because I feel like, unlike this nationalism part, I feel like the great replacement theory, I don't know. I don't know if I want to say that, this sense of racial superiority is built into it or is necessarily built into it, but it seems more closely aligned to it than it is theoretically to something like nationalism. Because why wouldn't you want people to like mix? You know what I mean?
Right. I mean,
Unless you thought that they were bad, unless you thought the other group was gonna bring your group down, right? If the other group if you thought that they were better than you,
yeah.
right? Then wouldn't you be in favor of mixing? Because then your kids would get their superior genes, right? Like,
Right. No, that's an important observation. So great replacement theory, just for folks who don't necessarily know what this is it's this idea that the white race is being, systematically replaced by non-white groups through a variety of factors. And this is key to what you just said. So it's a combination of things like immigration, especially like unchecked immigration, and but also low birth rates among white people. So declining birth rates coupled with increases in immigration create this fear, this sense that like white people are not only, you know, are not only vanishing, but they're being replaced by these other groups. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, people who, when you look at white nationalist spaces, like they'll say things like, well, why can't we just reinforce immigration from Europe? Like we're okay with that. So it's not immigration that's threatening. It's immigration of Black and brown people. Right. So, and you're absolutely right. Like it's seen as these groups are seen as less as inferior to these white people who endorse this ideology compared to the white stock, as they talk, the white racial stock, which is the superior genes and things like that.
Yeah. So, do you think that it counts as prejudice when people are misinformed?
Well, it technically counts as prejudice because if you remember, prejudice is just prejudging, right? So in fact, in fact, I would say most prejudices come from misinformation, from being misinformed, right?
Okay, so
So
it's not an ignorance. Oh, it is an ignorance because you don't know the facts, right? So you could it could be that you just know nothing, like including the false information, but it could also be that you believe in false information.
yes, yeah. So the most of the prejudice that we see that does damage, whether it's overt or implicit, whether it's active or sort of passive, and all of the above can do a lot of damage. Those prejudices are almost always rooted in some form of prevailing narrative that portrays that group as being either threatening physically or as violating some fundamental core value or moral that you hold dear, right? So let's say the values of meritocracy or hard work or individualism, right? When you think about groups that are, the most marginalized groups in our country, the stereotypes tend to be that they are, that they're lazy, they're criminals. Of course, what's the whole narrative about, these ICE raids? It's like, oh, we're going after the violent drug dealers and rapists when in fact they're just, rounding up people who are just going to work or, you know, going to their immigration interview and just minding their own business and contributing to society, right? So a lot of the stereotypes are really designed to get you to be afraid, to not only get you to be afraid, but to get you to see this group as being fundamentally dangerous to the community, both physically but also morally, also dangerous to the values that you or the country holds dear. Right. And so that's with that at the heart of the stereotypes, it can make that person seem culpable for some sort of negative behavior or lifestyle that then rationalizes criminalizing those groups or even reacting with violence towards those groups. And at the minimum, discriminating against those groups. Like, well, I'm not going to hire those types of people because, there's just too much criminality in that community or whatever that stereotype is, right? And so it can rationalize the perpetuation of inequality, it can rationalize, disparities in opportunity, and it can rationalize like over policing and school to prison pipeline types of things where we know that like Black kids get suspended at a much higher rate than white kids who do the exact same behaviors, right? So there's a lot of research on that. And so these stereotypes create these attributions that rationalize discrimination. And that's why even though people kind of grow up around those stereotypes, they don't necessarily engineer them from whole cloth. They're still responsible for the way that they react to them.
Do you think prejudice is rooted in fear? Like, do you think it's fundamentally a fear response?
So I think that there's systemic isms, systemic racism, systemic sexism. I think you have to look at it at different levels, right? As an individual walking down the street, it is rooted in either fear or like contempt, like when it comes to, prejudice against, people who are unhoused or, a lot of times it's a contempt emotion, or anger or outrage when we think that people are, taking advantage of the system or taking advantage of society or doing some behavior that's, dangerous or undesirable on purpose, right? So it's rooted in emotion, but those emotions and or disgust, right? A lot of the emotions that were associated with anti-LGBT prejudice is disgust emotion. So they're emotional reactions, but they really vary by the stereotype associated with the group. So what is that stereotype conveying about the group, and what's the emotion that's being triggered by that stereotype? And we see that those negative emotions, right, fear, anger, disgust, contempt, are mobilizing or mobilize the person psychologically to engage in behaviors that discriminate against those groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you ever feel that prejudice is justified? Or do you think it's just towards people? Or do you think it's, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, prejudice towards pedophiles. I think,
Is that a prejudice?
yeah, you don't know the person individually, right? But if you find out they're a pedophile, you're going to be like, "Yep, I don't like you." You've never
Oh,
met
hmm.
them. You've never had, prejudice against, people who I think there's a lot of people who are prejudiced against neo-Nazis.
But
I think they would say they're
okay.
they're they're justified,
I
right? So, I mean,
guess
that's yeah. Go on.
I guess I'm just trying to better understand what it means to be prejudiced against somebody because if it's could be, ignorance, or like being misinformed, then that part I get. That makes perfect sense to me. But if you dislike somebody because of a trait that they actually possess of, some immoral behavior, then that seems to me that you are informed about that person. I mean, maybe you don't know their life story, you don't know what type of food they eat, but
Yeah,
the part that's relevant is that, this person is a pedophile.
right. No, that's true. And there are distinctions, right? So, you know, I mean, and this is one of the challenges with rehabilitation and reintegration of people who commit crimes, for example. Like, how can, the community start to re-embrace a person who may have been incarcerated for a behavior. I'm not talking about pedophiles here. I'm talking about like, just so there's it's possible to have a reaction towards somebody that's absolutely grounded in fact, even if you don't know that person and even if you've never had a personal interaction with that person. And that's what I mean. Like there have been studies that looked at like huge varieties of groups and like what prejudices are more acceptable or less acceptable. And there's a lot of variability, right? And you're absolutely right. So when it's groups that are engaging in behaviors intentionally, then those behaviors are considered either criminal or hugely immoral. That's when people think that those prejudices are justified. Now, that's relevant because when we look at stereotypes of groups like racial groups or religious groups or gender or sexual orientation groups, a lot of the stereotypes are aimed at getting people to think that. They're aimed at getting people to believe that these people are in fact committing crimes or are in fact engaging in deeply immoral behavior, precisely because people feel like those prejudices are actually well informed and justifiable.
Okay, so then when does a prejudice become a judgment? Like a fair judgment, right? Like how much do you have to know about that person or group?
Well, I mean, individual by individual, like if you know that a person engaged in a particular behavior and you have evidence of it, then, we have things like criminal justice systems and, workplace policies and things like that deal with the person as an individual. But at that point you're not judging them based on their gender or their race or their religion or their sexual orientation. You're judging them based on their behavior outside of those categories. And that's the distinction, right? So when you start associating the identity with certain behaviors and attributions, that's when you're way off base, right? We know there's so much human diversity within groups and within communities. And so when you make the assumption that the person is doing something wrong just because, right, you assume they're criminals just because they're undocumented, or you assume they're, going to exploit your workplace just because they're people of color, or you assume they're going to be incompetent just because they're a woman, right? That's different. And so it's the difference between judging individuals based on their actual performance or behavior versus judging them by their group or filtering those judgments through the stereotypes of their group.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I'm wondering if there is, I don't know, I don't wanna say wiggle room, but it seems pretty natural for people to make judgments based on group membership. And I don't know if it's necessarily judging an individual person because they belong to that group, but rather just judgments about that particular group. Like when I sometimes, like, so almost all my friends, pretty much all my friends in LA are Asian. We talk about racial categories all the time, right? We make generalizations all the time, and we do think that there's some truth to these generalizations, right? If we didn't think that they were reflective of any sort of true reality, we wouldn't be using them.
Can you give me an example?
Asian people, especially East Asian people, highly value education. It's obvious. It's very obvious to like anybody in my community.
Right. Okay. Okay. So you're talking about making judgments about Asians.
Well, I mean, that's just the example that I gave because that's the
Okay.
first one that came to my
Okay.
mind. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
feel like I think everybody not everybody, but I think it's very common, and it makes sense to at least most people that there are general tendencies and commonalities between groups, especially if we're talking about something like culture or religion, right? Of course, there's going to be diversity. Of course, everyone is an individual, but I wonder if the push against making generalizations overall may sometimes backfire because there are people, maybe most people, who do actually believe that there are generalizations that we can accurately make. And if you're the person who says that we can't really make those generalizations, then that makes your position less plausible to most people.
Great. So great question. So many parts. So please be patient while I break down a couple of key things. For starters, like, yes, people make generalizations about all kinds of things. In fact, one of the most elegant things that our brain does is we categorize. Like, we categorize everything. We categorize, like, if you walk into an establishment and you see a red cube that's about 3 feet high and you have no idea what it is, and somebody tells you it's a chair, like, your category of chair is gonna tell you all kinds of information about that cube without you even touching it. You're gonna know its function, you're gonna know that, it can hold a certain amount of weight, you're gonna know, that it is gonna have a certain amount of comfort, right? You're gonna know all kinds of things just by that one singular piece of information, that category. Our brain does that with everything, and it's actually a really efficient thing that our brain does is that we do categorize. And so it allows us to navigate incredibly complicated environments pretty seamlessly because we can orient ourselves and then make adjustments from there. Right? Let's say someone tells you it's a chair, you sit on it, you think it's the most uncomfortable thing on earth, and you're like, not to me, it's a chair, and you don't buy it. That's fine. Right? But it gave you an orientation, it gave you a place to start. So that's something our brain does constantly. The content of that category is what makes it functional or dysfunctional, pro-social or antisocial, right? What are you putting into that database that you associate with that category, right? And so, and those can be wildly wrong, wildly incorrect, especially when it comes to something as diverse as human groups, right? So yes, absolutely. Knowing, like, I'm about to travel to two countries, one country I've never been in, and I want to know if there are cultural norms there that I need to be respectful of. Now, does that mean that everyone I encounter is going to expect me to follow those norms? Of course not. But it's going to give me a place to start, right? If it says that it is not normative to do XYZ in this culture, I'm going to try to avoid those behaviors, even though the people I'm interacting with may not care about them at all. Right. So when it comes to making those types of, trying to suss out, like, where do I stand? Where do I start when I'm interacting with a culture that's different from my own or a group that's different from my own? I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. And I do agree. We do that all the time. It becomes, I think we just have to realize that it's a starting place, not an ending place. Like, it orients us, sort of drops us on a map, a social map, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how to navigate very well. And if we also remember that a lot of the times we're gonna be, when it comes to individuals within that group, it's gonna be wrong a lot. It's going to be wrong a lot of the times, right? And so let's take that example of, well, let's take another group of like, I mean, a sort of assumption, for example, of East Asians care about education, right? So it's very possible that, East Asians in America care a lot about education. Would that apply to you know, rural areas in China? I don't know. Maybe they value agriculture. Right? I mean, that like there's a history, right? You have this immigrant community who probably, if they were able to cross a wide ocean, probably had means and privilege, and they come to America and they have this opportunity to thrive with our education system or whatever. That it may be different. Like it may not apply to every single East Asian culture or region within these countries. It might not apply to every person. And the other thing that's can be detrimental about that stereotype is, you know let's say, like, we know that AI is going to replace a lot of jobs that require college education, but the jobs that are not going to be replaced by AI anytime soon are the trades. Well, if people have a stereotype that Asians are not good with their hands, for example, then they're not going to get hired for trades, even though they might be just as competent and hardworking in the trades as any other group, right? So yes, you'll be right a lot of the time when it comes to something maybe a cultural value, but it's not going to apply to everyone, and it's not going to apply in every situation, and it can still do damage down the road in certain cases. The other thing I would say about that is, you say, well, East Asians value education. Is the subtext of that assumption, like, is the unspoken part more than other groups?
As far as I can tell, there might be a group that I have not been exposed to that
Yeah.
values education more than Asian people. I don't even wanna know how they raise their kids, okay? If they value education more than Asians, then I don't yeah. They would just be working all the time.
Yeah, and there are groups that absolutely do, right? So when you go outside of that environment, and right, that's the environment, right? That's the environment you grew up in, that's what you're most exposed to. When you start talking to people from other countries, you see that, like, there are countries in the Middle East where, oh my gosh, super values high education. Countries in Africa where, like, you absolutely positively must be educated, and you should get multiple degrees, by the way. Like really, really intense about education. Um, and so it really varies. I mean, I think there are so many cultures that prioritize education above all else, but the big caveat is the privileged class within those cultures, especially, right? So, so I think that yeah, like, what do we know? We know our in groups, and we want to feel good about our in groups. So we're going to be like, well, we value education. This is something that defines us. So therefore, it creates that it can widen the difference between the perceptions of our group versus the perceptions of other groups, even though the overlap is probably much bigger. And that's another downside of categorizing, right? So categorizing creates starker delineations between groups, even though there's more variability, right? So yes, East Asian culture may prioritize education, but lots of other cultures prioritize education. But once we form that stereotype, we widen the gap in our minds.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. I think I'm mostly been exposed to, I guess, like, white culture, like white people, you know? And in
Mhm.
my experience, Asians do value education more than white people. I still believe that, even though, like, like, I'm almost 40, you know? Um,
And that's a stereotype, and that's
it
one you
is
hold.
I mean, it is. I think it's true. Like, I remember the first time I learned that a C was average, I was like, "Please, who came up with these standards? C is not an average to an Asian person, like, to an Asian family, oh my goodness. Like, you would get punished if you got a C, okay."
But C is
Uh,
C is not average to a lot of white families either.
oh, yeah, yeah. Again, right, it's, like, very diverse. I mean, even that category of white is hugely
Yeah,
diverse,
huge.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. No, I completely understand. So the other part that I mentioned, and I kinda wanna maybe get into this a little bit, is I want Yeah, I don't want people to be prejudiced, right? I don't like it when people oppress other people and discriminate against other people. Sometimes I feel like the way that we approach this problem may backfire.
Mhm. Absolutely.
And I think one of the ways that came to mind is rejecting the concept of or rejecting the legitimacy of just making generalizations at all,
Yeah.
right? Because I think most people do think that you can make accurate generalizations. And so let's say this, like let's say Americans are afraid of this particular group because of whatever. Okay. And maybe a lot of that's maybe it's just being espoused by this like the radical right. Maybe it's AI that's being programmed by people to instill fear and to affect our political landscape. That all might be true, right? If the reaction is, oh, you're just being racist or you're being whatever such and such phobic, right? This stuff is not true, then I feel like what that group is going to feel like that they're being attacked and
Mhm.
they're going to dig in their heels,
Mhm.
right? So I think there has to be some deeper dive into the data and the facts,
Yeah.
right? It can't just be just hand wavy dismissive, like, oh, you're just
I agree.
racist. And
I
then
agree.
like, oh, you call me racist? Like you woke as people call everybody racist. Everyone's a
Yeah.
racist.
No, no, I'm actually glad you're bringing this up, and I think that this has become a really big problem when it comes to getting people from different groups to actually have those meaningful exchanges, is creating this sense of, like, you can never make a mistake, right? And, like, if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, then you're a racist or you're a sexist or you're not, you're not woke enough or whatever, or, you're gonna get canceled, and that happens on the left and the right. In fact, cancel culture, I'm old enough to remember the '80s when, like, it was the right wing that was, promoting cancel culture, right? Like, so, I mean, that happens on both across the spectrum, across the ideological spectrum of this idea that, if you say or do the wrong thing, one and done, one strike, you're out, and there's no redemption, and your career and your reputation or your friend groups or whatever are going to be destroyed. Like, I just think that's a very, very unhealthy way of approaching this because you're absolutely right. People do make generalizations. And what they need to understand is that people are going to make generalizations, but pay attention to the things that are more predictive of the things you're trying to predict. Race is wildly unpredictable. Like, race by itself you're going to be wrong most of the time. But for example, like, if like, I ride the train all the time, right? I'm not going to pay attention to race because I know that's going to be mostly irrelevant when I'm riding the train at night. I'm going to pay attention to gang tattoos, right? Certain types of way that I know that, like, I'm going to pay attention to to, like, really fidgeting behavior. I'm going to pay attention to aggressive facial expressions. I'm going to make generalizations, but I'm going to make the generalizations using data that actually are predictive. Race is not one of those data points, right? So that's one of the things that people have to understand. Like, don't we are going to make generalizations, and that's just something that our brain naturally does. But how can we make those generalizations more informed versus less informed, and more and less toxic and antisocial?
Yeah, I think that example of, riding the train at night is a good one, because you could look into the data and, base your I don't know, your behavior on what the facts are, right? What is most likely going to be a threat? I would say probably like men are a greater threat, right? Physically,
Definitely.
right?
I hate to say it. Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
obviously you don't want to judge, this particular
Right.
guy, right? Yeah, yeah, don't.
Right. I mean,
So
I'm gonna add more data points to men,
yeah. Yeah,
but
so, like,
I
it's not
told
gonna
my
be old
kids.
men, it's young men, right? But
Yeah.
it's also not three-year-olds, right? It's, like,
Right.
this age between, like, 15 and maybe, like, 25, you know?
Yeah. I mean, one example is, I when my kids were little, I was like, if you ever get lost, go into the nearest, Walgreens or Starbucks or whatever the store is nearby and find a woman who works there, right?
Mm.
I mean, that's a total generalization. Would a man help my kids? Absolutely. They probably 99% of them probably would, but that was a generalization. That was me hedging my bets and saying, chances are, I know the statistics, and chances are that they're going to be slightly more safe probabilistically in this situation. But they'll be, you know, safe with most men also. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that those generalizations happen. And I think what's really important is to have those conversations. So the thing that we lack in our society, and I really try to push this also at the university as well. We have these dialogue series, and I talk about this a lot in my prejudice and intergroup relations classes. We have to be, I call it constructive discomfort. Like, we have to have uncomfortable conversations. We have to be willing to make mistakes and not be demonized for not knowing the right thing to say or not knowing about a person's or a group's history. We have to be able to go on that uncomfortable journey together if we're ever going to bridge these gaps.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.